I'll
Yep,
record,
I'll
start
certainly do that.
recording, and okay, please take it away, Keenan.
All right, can you see my screen, Jocelyn and John?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Hi, Jocelyn. Where are you from, Jocelyn, real quick?
I'm here in Korea with John.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, I'm Keenan Fagan, a professor at Dongguk University, and the paper that I'm preparing for publication and presenting to you today is titled How Chinese Students in an American TESOL Practicum Appropriated Ideas for Communicative Teaching Through Dialogue and Post-Lesson Reflections. And I'm wondering if I can get out of there with the participants. Okay, there we go, I think. All right. My paper addresses the following research problem. Most experts in TESOL and ELT would agree that our professional approach is CLT. We got to get the students working in pairs and groups on tasks, right? And in a world culture of education, China's Ministry of Education also mandates CLT for its public schools. But teachers there resist CLT to follow Confucius heritage cultural practices of explaining vocabulary and grammar and drilling students for a state exam, the Gaokao. Studies on practicum ESL teaching show that while university ELT programs advocate CLT, student teachers follow their mentors, they struggle to implement CLT, and in reflections, they side with their mentors and oppose their supervisors who plea for CLT implementation, and thereby cultural practices are reproduced. However, these days, many Chinese students are in Western and American TESOL and ELT programs, and my 2019 study found that just like Chinese student teachers in China, they reproduce cultural practices also, but have a strong communicative teaching intent. Otherwise, we know very, very little about Chinese student teacher work in Western practicums. This study that I'm presenting to you today asks this question. In post-lesson reflection, how do Chinese student teachers interact with the supervisor in seeking solutions to problems of practice that interfere with student communication? Skinner and Abbott tells us on this question that they'll experience culture bumps. They want the supervisor to tell them exactly how to teach, and they don't like all the question and answers of post-lesson reflections, all the messiness, so to speak. But other than this, we know almost nothing. So this paper's qualitative grounded theory inquiry will address this knowledge gap by analyzing the post-lesson reflections of 4 Chinese student teachers with me, their supervisor. And following the work of Engstrom and Gutierrez, my study theorizes international student work through activity systems. Chinese student teachers will bring concepts and practices of teaching from their home culture into the American TESOL systems program where they're learning to teach. While I was doing my dissertation for several years, I was an instructor in an American MA TESOL program at a major university, research university in the southern United States. All the students there were from the People's Republic of China. They had mixed classes of up to 30 with American education majors, and the classes modeled a CLT with group and pair activities. I began a 4-year ethnographic study of their learning and development while I was there. As part of my work and data collection, I supervised practicums. I supervised 15 student teachers from China, and I collected full data sets on 10 of these. The data included the minutes and feedback that I wrote while observing lessons. There you see me observing a practicum lesson and writing minutes and feedback. I also audio taped our post-lesson reflections, which is the primary data source for this study. And I collected an assortment of other data, including lesson plans, emails, lesson materials, and post-practicum interviews with the mentor teachers. The practicum sites were the university's ESL center and a local church. The students there were adults, many of the spouses of graduate students in our university. They were well educated and spoke English at intermediate to advanced levels. Importantly, the class objectives in these sites were to develop student communication skills, practice CLT, but student teachers struggled to implement CLT. Of the 10 for which I had full data sets, I selected 4 by maximum variation sampling in their uptake of CLT. They were June, who showed the greatest change. His first lesson was totally teacher-centered, while his second and third lessons were great examples of CLT implementation. And Chaoxing, who showed back and forth movement. In her first lesson, she struggled to implement a role play. In her second lesson, she successfully implemented an information gap. And in her third lesson, she attempted to teach over 120 vocabulary words. Quite a few, huh? Li Ying showed consistent CLT implementation across her 3 lessons, and Di Lin showed inabilities to take up CLT. So amongst the 10 for which I had full data sets, these 4 were most representative of the unique variations in uptake of CLT that emerged through the practice. My 2019 study that found that they had 2 types of problems interfering with student communication. One type occurred when they were enacting practices that are common in China's classrooms. And these problems included a focus on language, not functions, explaining vocabulary. That problem occurred in 6 of 12 lessons. Reading words or phrases, lecturing, no communicative activity, and distancing from students. Another type of problem occurred when they were attempting to implement CLT activity or communicative activity. And these problems showed communicative teaching intent. They included grouping students, lesson material problems, unclear instructions or directions, no modeling or model lacking, no purpose or objective in the activity, or not following the lesson plans. Knowing these problems, I could identify parts of our post-lesson transcripts when we were discussing these problems so that I could analyze these parts to answer this study's research question. In post-lesson reflections, how did we interact in seeking solutions to problems of practice that interfered with student communication? I want to say a little bit about something about problems of practice here. Why did I use that? Well, they naturally occurred in reflections. At the beginning of our first reflection, June said, and another problem is that some of them are used to the words and some of them didn't get it. Problems also reoccurs in the literature. I used it for simplicity, and I want to make a note that the problems of this study are those for learning and professional growth. There were no problems with the participants or their practice teaching because that was a natural part of their learning to teach. I highly respect them and Chinese culture. I analyzed data through several different angles. One angle was through the Bloom and Egan-Robertson heuristic for investigating the social construction of intertextuality. And that's very complicated, isn't it? Yeah, so I modified the heuristic and drew out the key elements. I plugged in transcript over here from our post-lesson reflections when we were discussing problems. I looked at the form of our utterances and interactions, their function, what they reference, whether we recognized and acknowledged the references, and most importantly for analysis, their social consequences. I also extracted theoretical questions from the literature to ask of our dialogues. A couple of these include, do we establish ties across time, text, and events? Another is dialogue focused on the object of the activity and aimed at making an answer to a question or a solution to a problem? I asked these questions of dialogue with each of the participants. I also counted instances of reoccurring moves in our interactions. One of these, the top one in blue, is supervisor and student teacher in open disagreement or not connecting. I also counted how many times student teachers asked questions when they didn't understand the supervisor. Through analysis from these angles, 6 findings were generated. The first was that we had big disagreements about vocabulary teaching. And even though Li Ying successfully implemented CLT activity in her first lesson, we still had a disagreement about her first 23 minutes of explaining vocabulary at the board. And when I brought up that part, she said, "I think the explanation is necessary for them." To which I asked, "Why do you think it was necessary?" The student teachers believed that their students needed a lot of vocabulary, even though they were adults and were fluent in basic English. And they also believed, the student teachers believed, that their students couldn't learn from each other. There was not enough time for communicative language teaching, so they thought, I must explain this important vocabulary in serious study. They considered this a normal practice. They were resistant to change, and it was hard for them to reflect on change. Their attitudes changed through dialogue and as the practicum was going on. But at the beginning, they were very worried that students couldn't learn from each other and that they had to do a lot of explaining. Countering this, I said their explanations were unnecessary, long, and denied students communicative learning opportunities. We needed to find a communicative way. Fortunately, analysis showed that our disagreement spurred reflection and change. After Li Ying came to see that, well, her explaining was a little bit problematic, I asked her, if you're going to do it another time, how would you do it? And she said, I think maybe I'd just give the words to the tables and let them come up with their own definitions. I said, that sounds like a pretty good idea. And sure enough, she implemented that in her second lesson. Another one of my findings was that the student teachers and I had very different conceptions of TESOL practice. They were able to see minor and obvious and general communication problems in their lessons, but my professional vision was usually needed to highlight CLT problems in lesson parts that I had noted in the minutes and the feedback. Here's a table right here showing this. At the beginning of Xiaoxing's reflection, she was worried that she couldn't answer all the questions immediately. At the beginning of June's, he said there was lecturing, and little communication. This was obvious and general. To bridge our different conceptions of CLT, my third finding was that we engaged in a 6-stage process of progressive dialogue to seek solutions to CLT problems. Each stage had a particular purpose. The purpose at our beginning was to open assessments on the lesson. Assessments are a broad category that can include general observations about the lesson, facts about the lesson, reasons for occurrences, and opinions about why things happen. To begin this stage, I would usually ask a warm question like, well, how do you think it went? And the student teachers offered a lot. Curiously, even in successful lessons, they talked about problems. Then after that, we worked on building assessments. We were building a knowledge of what had occurred in the lesson and creating kind of a shared understanding. The student teachers were the dialogical leaders. I asked them little questions and encouraged them to speak. But generally during this stage, they were unable to focus on a problematic part that I had noted. I would usually have to initiate this, and usually to do that, I used a reference to a student-teacher assessment, or I referenced the textual authority of my minutes and feedback. But it was hard for them to focus on problems. It was hard to us to achieve mutual focus. When we could, we moved to the next stage, which was agreeing on the problem. And this involved reconstructing the problematic part right there. And there were lots of digressions in this. I tend to ask students follow-up questions when they were digressing. And it was also difficult to agree because, of course, we had different views on student behavior. But when we achieved agreement, then we'd move to the next stage of searching for a solution. And it was really interesting to do the analysis because over and over again, I found myself asking these questions. So if you were going to do it again, how would you do it? What would you, for example, in Xiaoxing's first reflection, what would you try to do differently to get them to play roles? The student teachers offered ideas. I recognized some of them. When I couldn't, I would scaffold them through a series of Socratic questions. And sometimes they came up with fixes, as Li Ying did, and sometimes they didn't. When they didn't, I would coach what I call a redo fix for the lesson. And this was the most painful part of our stages for me to analyze, because it was me talking, showing, giving ideas, and the student teachers politely following along and going, yeah. But fortunately, analysis found that June and Li Ying appropriated 2 coached ideas from our first reflections for implementation in their second lessons. Through those 6 stages, the student teachers exercised many important dialogical moves, but I found that there were 2 principal dialogical moves that were driving their uptake of CLT. One was responsibly following the supervisor or mentor teachers. And Li Ying did a great job of that in our first reflection. She followed my questions, added interpretations, sought a common understanding, allowed criticism, had a spirit of inquiry, realized the problem, and as I just mentioned, found the fix. Not all student teachers were able to do that, however. Dylan's mentor teacher, Tom, said of him, he was one of those guys who would sort of nod along and say, yes, I get it. And then you find out he really doesn't get it. And one of the reasons he didn't get it was because he did not ask questions of his supervisor and mentor teacher. Another dialogical move that was driving uptake of CLT was giving the specific fix and believing in it. And here we see an example of this on the modeling problem that Chao-Xing had in trying to implement her first role play. And here, over and over again in the dialogues too, even when we generally agreed on a problem and what to do, I would ask the students for the specific things they would say, the specific things that they would do. And here I do that again. I say, now if you did that, so if you were helping them get into that kind of pretend mode as a teacher, what could you do? And Chao-Xing plays along with the game. She goes, maybe I can model first. Invite one of them to be my partner to model one sample, a short sample. What are we going to do? And she goes on. Maybe like you, just like you said, using a chair as a door and knocking on it. Yeah, I can do that. Here we can see that she believes in the fix. And sure enough, in her second lesson, which was the implementation of an information gap, she began, well, after the second lesson, she began our reflection by saying, I thought the first lesson was better. It certainly wasn't. The second lesson was much better. But this time I gave clear instructions and modeled, and she certainly had done that. And one of the reasons was because she played the game of giving the specific fix and believing in it. My fifth finding was that when we could accomplish the purpose of stages, the student teachers appropriated ideas from our dialogue and implemented them in their lessons. There were, here it's 6, but 2 of them are the same. The 2 ones at the top are Chao-Xing's modeling. We made one attempt and then we digressed and had to make another attempt. But in all of these instances, we accomplished the stages of dialogue to find a viable fix, and the student teachers implemented that fix in a successive lesson for successful communicative activity. But when we could not complete all the stages, the student teachers had recurring problems. And that was very, very interesting to find out. So the stages seem to be able to allow them to slowly come to realizations of problems and understand how to create a fix. But if a piece was missing, they didn't seem to understand. I don't regard this finding as a reason for problems in proceeding lessons, but it was certainly a factor. And my 6th finding is that the student teachers appropriated many ideas for communicative teaching through dialogue. The student teachers I found 15 instances of appropriation. There were 5 instances when the student teachers gave the specific fix. Even Dylan appropriated ideas for more communicative classes though these were usually in whole class settings where there was just one person talking at a time. Dialogue certainly moves student teachers to CLT practice. And Molly, one of the other mentor teachers, gave a reason for this. She said they knew that they had to change their initial teaching because they were receiving the same messages from me and from you and other mentor teachers that their practices just weren't going to work. Many of these, as I mentioned, were cultural practices, what we call the apprenticeship of observation. The implications from my study for teacher development are that beginning teacher conceptions of TESOL are certainly going to differ from professional approaches. Differing conceptions can be bridged through reflective dialogue on practice. And in this, disagreement is certainly going to arise, but this can be productive for change. I'm worried about supervisors who will shy away from this because the disagreement, as Bach team finds, is something that's very important. Achieving understanding with supervisors and mentors is not easy for student teachers and must proceed through stages. Change often occurs in a delayed response. I think that applies to students as well. Certain dialogical skills are necessary for understanding and dialogical processes. To appropriate professional ideas, student teachers need to give specific fixes for problems of practice. Mentor and supervisor messages should be aligned and reinforce each other. This is a big problem in China, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And reflective and challenging dialogue on practice teaching generates professional teacher change and development. It's my hope that more research like this study will better inform TESOL educators of the dialogical processes and learning to teach. Thank you. And do you have any questions that you would like to ask me?
Excellent. Wow.
Not specifically, but my PhD student is focusing on dialogical processes and in terms of like exam writing for the IELTS. So I enjoyed your presentation and it connected with some of the things that I've also been studying while reading his work.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I don't envy your PhD student because I didn't know what I was getting into,
It's
you know,
hard.
and so, yeah. And so I had to go into a whole exploration of the literature on dialogue. And John, you said you like sociocultural studies in your little blurb about yourself. So I examined a big sociocultural field. If you go back, if you look at the recording, recommend that book up on that slide, Vygotsky and blah, blah, blah practices. That has great studies in it. 2000 book.
Great. I had one question for you, Keenan. Are you finished with your supervision of that group of students, or the 4 students you were explaining? You're
All
describing?
done. Yeah, all done. Yeah, that happened a few years ago.
Okay.
But analyzing the data has not been easy. And you know, it's like in working on this paper stemming from my dissertation, I'm like, God, do I just close this or do I go back and take another look? You know, you always want to do that. But anyway, I gotta get this into press.
Good for you.
Yeah. Great. Pina or Ray, any questions or thoughts for Keenan or Dr. Fagan?
Thank you, Dr. Keenan. I would like to ask about lesson planning for today. You know, things have changed so far. What do you think about lesson planning and following the lesson plans for today? Are we as teachers supposed to follow really for today?
Well, I tell you, when I had to start teaching online, I was like, oh, wow. You know, and it was like about a 4-week process. You know, it was like a 4-week process of thinking about how am I going to solve problems. And the first big problem that I wanted to solve was I did not want to receive 50 student emails every day. And I was like, how can we find a shared space where I can just go in there and I don't have to download emails and download attachments and download student essays and all that business. And Google Docs was the answer. So I mean, fortunately, there's a lot of good workarounds. And here in Korea, the students are so responsible. God, we have good students at Dongguk University for sure. I bet you do at Wayday too. And you know, I mean, they never mess with any of the shared documents or anything else like that. So I guess that's my beginning answer. Do you want to add anything there for me to respond to? Peanut?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it just takes a lot. I think it takes a lot more work, a lot more thinking because it's different. However, there's some good things about this, perhaps. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it, but one good thing is it might get people away from apprenticed or cultural practices just a little bit because they have to do it in some kind of a new mode. But one of the things I'm finding with our Korean professors is that they tell the students, and my students tell me this, they tell the students, turn off your mic, turn off your camera, and listen to me.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's teaching, and I don't think that's university work, frankly speaking. I would call that a problem of practice. but that's the way it goes, I guess.
Well, not communicative education for sure, right? Just not at all.
Well, I
If that's what
mean,
they're doing.
originally that's what universities are about, and the whole literature, our whole theoretical framework, especially sociocultural framework, is that all learning is dialogical and dialectical.
Right.
And so basically, these professors they're violating one of the central tenets of education. And by the way, if you go back into the old culture and you look at, for instance, the Analects of Confucius, what you're going to see is you're going to see dialogue that looks just like the Socratic dialogues between Confucius and his students. And so you're going to see the same thing. So when somebody says, "Oh, well, this is cultural," you have to ask them what period of culture.
Right.
Yeah.
It needs to be specified. And thank you again, Dr. Fagan. And there are a few other presentations going on that started at 5 p.m. if anyone is interested. And this has been recorded, and this will be, I don't exactly know the location, but the recorded synchronous sessions like this one will be made available eventually. So I hope you all enjoyed the conference.
Thanks,
yes.
Ray. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening, and enjoy the final sessions if you choose to attend. Goodbye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.